severe, sustained, brutal attack.
This is not something that you can do in a second or 2 seconds in a moment of madness.
The viciousness of the crime was definitely a 1 in a million case.
Hi, glad to see you back on the channel. What do you think of when you think of crazy love? Perhaps two young people madly in love with each other? Or perhaps obsessed with each other, willing to go to any lengths to secure each other's love? Yep, crazy love can become truly toxic, especially when both partners behave obsessively towards one another. This is the case of Tracy Andrews and her fiance, Lee Harvey. It's about to get very upsetting, but if you're ready for it, let's dive in. It always starts with an unstable family, doesn't it? Well, today's story begins on April 9th, 1969 in Birmingham, UK. This is where Tracy Andrews was born. She was raised in Redditch, then in Alvechurch. These are small, peaceful towns in the suburban area of Birmingham. But there was nothing peaceful about Tracy's childhood.
She was the middle child. She had an older sibling and a younger sibling and several half-siblings. And her parents broke up when she was around about 6 years old because they'd had quite a volatile relationship.
One day, Tracy woke up and saw her dad walk out the front door. He never came back. This was a very big moment for Tracy, and a very dark one indeed. Tracy not only experienced the painful divorce, but all of the horrible fighting beforehand. The very first years of her life were ridden with arguments, screaming, name-calling, and stress, which spread from her parents to her and all of her siblings. It was a chaotic and unhappy house.
Well, Tracy's parents split up and her mother got married to another man. And when we look at our parents' relationships, they are quite important because they inform our expectations of other people, our expectations of the relationships that we go on to have.
Unfortunately, Tracy grew up in a house full of turmoil, and her parents never made time to listen to her. They were too busy fighting, leaving, getting back together, or finding new partners. On top of that, they had several children from several relationships. This meant that they couldn't spend time with all of them at the same time. They would always split up the little time they had between the children. After the split, Tracy felt like she was the last on her parents' priority list. Her father was gone, and her mother was spending a lot of time with her new partner.
Kids need attention, they need to be loved and cuddled and everything. And a lot of kids that come from those kind of broken homes, and the case of Tracy, they want to be loved by mother, father, or somebody. So that is definitely, in my opinion, one of the things that pushed her into always wanting the attention of other men.
Indeed, Tracy's teenage and young adult years were defined by her constant seeking of attention and approval. Tracy left school when she was just 13 years old. She wanted to be a model, but she didn't know exactly where to start. For the time being, she worked as a hairdresser. When she was 20, Tracy met a young man, Andy. The two became a couple pretty much immediately. Tracy wasn't one for waiting, and within a year, the couple had a baby daughter named Carla. However, easy come, easy go. Tracy's relationship didn't last more than a year. And there's a dark reason behind her relationship's failure.
What we've got here is a woman who doesn't like her partners having a life that doesn't involve her. She doesn't like her partners going out without her. She gets very jealous, she's very possessive.
Again, it all boils down to her childhood. Tracy suffered from a pretty extreme case of anxious attachment. As her parents were extremely volatile and fought in front of her regularly, Tracy didn't trust her parents. The bad example her family had set meant she would always fear abandonment and rejection. Unfortunately, instead of seeking help, Tracy would only seek fights.
She certainly had a temper. Everybody who knew her said she had a temper, and when she lost her temper, everybody knew about it. She would shout at the top of her voice. The whole street would hear.
Andy decided to leave Tracy when he simply couldn't handle her shouting and controlling behavior anymore. Tracy lost a lot of friends and boyfriends as a result of this toxic behavior, and perhaps more tragically, she attracted people that behaved in a similar way, only to encourage her issues to resurface over and over again. In 1994, Tracy was 25 years old and living in a council flat in Alvechurch. She hadn't given up on her dreams of becoming a model, and even had a few photo shoots with the aim to get her face in the newspaper and potentially attract an agent.
She had visions, she had dreams of becoming a model, but and she was very photogenic. She looked good on camera, and she knew it, and she had some pictures taken and a photo album put together, but that never really took off either.
Meanwhile, she was working as a barmaid at the Red Lion pub in Alvechurch.
She became a barmaid working in a pub, but she still dressed very provocatively, and she still loved talking to men and chatting to men. Again, seeking the attention that she wanted to get as a model, because obviously when you're that pretty and you're a model, you do get a lot of attention.
It's safe to say that at this point, Tracy was not fulfilled. She was a single mom with a history of failed relationships, no education, and little to no money. Her dream of becoming a successful model was what kept her going. It meant money and the attention she had always craved. But in 1994, something even better happened to Tracy. She met a 23-year-old man, Lee Harvey. The two had quite a lot in common. They lived in the same neighborhood, they were both single parents, and they both had a young daughter from a previous relationship. Lee loved young Danielle more than anything in the world, and he wanted to make sure he was there for her and that he could provide for her.
Lee Harvey was a young man from a very close family, and he worked as a bus driver for the West Midlands Travel. So this was a job that involved meeting many people on a daily basis. He was very outgoing. He was interested in cars and was always very well turned out. So he was your typical young Birmingham lad, essentially.
Lee was very close to his mother and sister, spending most of his free time with them and his daughter, whenever he wasn't partying at the local nightclubs. It was at a nightclub that Lee met Tracy. According to their friends, it was an instant mutual attraction, for fear of using the expression love at first sight, and things moved even faster than they did with Tracy and Andy.
Well, Lee and Tracy met in October 1994 in Ritzy's nightclub in Birmingham, and this relationship really did develop at a lightning pace. They had moved in with one another only around 3 months into the relationship, so this was going very, very fast.
Lee moved into Tracy's house and committed to a long-term relationship with her, but the two barely knew each other. The darker twist was that they didn't really trust each other.
And their relationship was quite a volatile one. They were both quite possessive, quite jealous when it came to the other's relationships with the opposite sex.
Perhaps there's a pretty simple explanation behind this, as pointed out by psychologist and criminologist Elizabeth Yardley.
And you often find this in relationships that develop very quickly. You haven't got that foundation of trust that's been built. You're always a little bit kind of suspicious as to what the other person's up to because you don't really know them.
Yep. Crazy love can sound romantic and desirable in a book or a movie, but in real life, it also comes with a lot of distrust. Unfortunately, Tracy and Lee were a toxic mix from this point of view.
And they would row, and they would fight like cat and dog, and neighbours would report how voices would be raised at all hours of the day and night, and would go on for hours, and then stop, and then start again.
These should be huge red flags. No one should be having constant, violent arguments within a few months of being together. And one particular fight was so bad, most people would have ended the relationship right there and then. One night, Tracy was planning to go out with her girlfriends. She explicitly asked Lee not to tag along as she wanted a girls' night out. Lee said okay, but a few hours later, Tracy found him in the same nightclub as her. Was this just a coincidence? Perhaps Lee wanted to go dancing or meet his friends too, or was he checking up on her? They both had trust issues, and it's likely Lee suspected Tracy of seeing other men. Tracy threw a fit that was loud even inside a nightclub. Several heads turned towards her, only to see her slap, punch, and then take a out of Lee's neck. One of Lee's close friends described the mark on his neck as a bite out of an apple, except the chunk was still there. Sheesh. You might think Lee packed his bags and left Tracy for good, but what happened was quite the opposite. A few days later, Lee proposed to Tracy, and she said yes. This was 6 months into their relationship. Perhaps this was their way of saying, I commit to this relationship no matter how bad it gets. But they would never get married. In fact, they kept breaking up and getting back together again.
So maybe almost a carbon copy of what Tracy grew up with in her house. She had a very explosive temper, and Lee Harvey also, in a way, wouldn't like just bow down to her screaming, so he would scream back.
And they weren't just shouting at each other loud enough for their neighbors to hear. Tracy would also grab Lee's objects and throw them out the window, urging him to get out of her house, only to invite him back days or weeks later.
She was forever throwing him out into the street, and she would throw his clothes out of the window or in a black bin bag and chuck him out the front door, change the locks, and then they would have reconciliations.
It was a vicious cycle with no end, or so it seemed.
This went on for a period of about 2 years.
Although Tracy and Lee were determined to somehow make their troubled relationship work, neither of them was willing to work on their trust issues. Every single time, their fights would boil down to Lee's relationship with his daughter's mom, Anita. Anita and Lee had broken up very soon after Danielle's birth, but they agreed to stay civil. More than that, they decided to stick closely together for the sake of Danielle. This meant that they would often spend their weekends together and do lots of fun activities, the three of them, or even together with Lee's sister or mom. Needless to say, Tracy hated this. She hated how much time Lee would spend with someone other than her, and she was convinced there was more than friendship between Lee and Anita. After all, they'd had a baby together. Sure, but she had also had a baby with someone else. And sadly, Lee had a problem with that too. Oftentimes during their fights, Lee would tell Tracy that he knew she still had feelings for Andy. How could they find a solution to a problem that they both had? They were too busy pointing their finger at the other person to start working on their own issues and insecurities. There was another dimension to Tracy and Lee's issues. Lee's family couldn't stand Tracy, and more than once, Tracy gave them a reason to feel this way. When Tracy and Lee got engaged, Tracy was very excited about announcing the news to everyone around her. Remember, this was a woman who craved all the attention she could get, and news of an engagement would definitely put her in the center of the room for a few days or weeks. So Tracy organized a big family barbecue on a weekend day, gathering her relatives and Lee's for the big announcement. However, as they were sitting down at the table, Lee's sister Michelle stood up and made an announcement. She and her fiancé had just gotten engaged. Everyone at the table clapped, cheered, and went over to hug Michelle and marvel at her brand new ring.
Daughter was getting engaged, and we had got a family gathering. Tracy Andrews came to this barbecue that we had, and my daughter had said that she was going to get engaged. Tracy Andrews just ran into my living room and cried and performed, and went into sort of a rage.
Perhaps unsurprisingly, Tracy was lobster red with anger. She had a full-blown tantrum in front of everyone. She accused Lee's family of plotting against her, and Michelle of getting engaged just to steal her thunder. Yeah, someone getting engaged just to make her feel bad. People tried to tell her that no one knew about her and Lee's engagement, but Tracy would hear none of it. Lee's family had said of Tracy that she was arrogant and controlling before, but now they were adamant they did not want to see her again and advised Lee to do the same. But once again, Lee was under Tracy's thumb. Over the next few months, further tension piled up between Tracy and Michelle. Michelle's wedding was coming up, and Tracy wanted her daughter, Carla, to be a bridesmaid at her wedding. But it soon became clear that Michelle was reluctant. As a result, Tracy ordered Lee not to attend his sister's wedding. This was just another big red flag for Lee. What kind of partner forbids you from attending your sister's big day? It was her or Michelle's wedding, Tracy said. Sadly, Lee chose Tracy. After Michelle's wedding, Lee's mom said she wanted nothing to do with Tracy anymore. If Lee wanted to stick with her, fine, but she and Michelle didn't want to see her ever again. So Tracy pulled another stunt, but it took a while until everyone caught on. Tracy got pregnant. Lee was over the moon. He was gonna be a dad. He and Tracy were making plans for a better future and promising each other to try and have a more stable relationship. But soon enough, Tracy fell down some stairs and had a. This was a huge blow to the whole family, including Lee's mom and sister. They realized what painful moments Tracy must be going through, and they started visiting her again. The whole family was brought together amidst a crisis. Except, Tracy had never fallen down any stairs or she'd had an abortion behind Lee's back. It took a few months until Lee figured this out, and he was beyond furious. He felt fooled, betrayed, humiliated in front of his whole family. Had Tracy done all of this to get the attention from Lee's mom again? It was simply sick. However, Lee still did not break up with Tracy. Months passed, and Tracy and Lee's relationship was, as always, a carousel. They would fight, sometimes they would break up, they would get back together, promising to make it all right again. But it was about to come to a final halt. It was December 1st, 1996. Tracy was taking Carla and Danielle out for the day. The two girls had become good friends, and the couple was trying to integrate both of them into their big new family. But at the end of the play date, Lee offered to take Danielle to her home, to Anita's home. Of course, Tracy got very jealous of Lee, and she started accusing him of having an affair with Anita. Why else would he take his daughter home? Because he's her dad? But none of his arguments worked on Tracy. She had made up her mind. He was cheating on her. Tracy and Lee fought the entire evening, so bad that their neighbors could hear. This wasn't news, even to the neighbors, but it seemed to be worse than ever. However, hours passed and the voices were eventually lowered. Around 9 p.m., they decided to go to a pub and have a drink.
So they'd been rowing all day. Lee tended to be the peacemaker, and it was probably Lee's suggestion, why don't we go for a drink? Why don't we just get a change of scene, a breath of fresh air? Let's get out of here. Let's just go and relax and have a drink. And that's what they did.
They drove to Brooms Grove, which was about 10 minutes away by car from their place. They had a few pints, and at 9:45 they left.
Tracy claimed that after they'd left the pub and Lee was driving, that they'd become involved in a road rage incident. Essentially, that a man in a dark Ford Sierra, there'd been some kind of altercation, and he'd started following them.
Tracy and Lee drove down some dark and narrow countryside lanes, but the car was pestering them, driving really close to them, then pulling back, and so on.
And she's suddenly aware that this car is behind, lights flashing right on their tail. Lee starts to accelerate. They're snaking together through the lanes. The other car then effectively draws Lee to a halt.
Lee stepped out of the car, and so did the other car's driver. A confrontation began, and the two started throwing insults at each other.
The driver then has said what he wants to say, apparently. He gets back in the car. Lee is still outside his car. And then the passenger gets out, a fat man with staring eyes, and he goes up to Lee and attacks Lee in a way that Tracy doesn't quite see.
Lee fell to the ground. He was unarmed and unsuspecting. The man began Lee, and Tracy left the car.
Then she piles in, she says, to go to Lee's defense, because she says she's not the kind of girl to just sit there and see her man being attacked. At which point she gets smacked by the fat man in the eyes and repeatedly gets up and is knocked out.
What happened next was pretty hazy, according to Tracy. She and her fiance were lying on the ground when the man stopped attacking them. He went back inside the car and the two attackers drove off. Tracy could finally rush to Lee's aid. To her shock, Lee was lying in a pool of red, his gurgling as liquid was spilling out from his severed arteries. He was beyond salvation. But they were feet away from a house called Keeper's Cottage. One of its residents came out upon hearing all the noise and was shocked at the scene. Tracy was cradling Lee, covered in and crying.
There's a woman standing there with her back to the car. There's a body, prone body on the floor. He instantly runs back into the house saying, call the police, call the police, call the ambulance.
The police arrived at the scene within minutes, and Tracy told them the horrific story. But initially, she said she couldn't remember the make of the car or the men's faces too well, as it was dark. She was in shock, the police figured. The case was handed to Detective Superintendent Ian Johnston.
I received a call from West Mercia Constabulary Operations Room, which directed me to the scene at Cooper's Hill, where I met with divisional representatives. Present at that time was Lee's car, Lee's body, and Tracy Andrews was inside Keeper's cottage, having been found in the road outside.
As soon as Ian Johnston heard Tracy's story, he went to check the car's tires.
I could see Lee's vehicle. It was pulled in on the near side of the road, travelling towards Alvechurch, and it didn't appear to have been stopped in any great hurry. It looked as though it had been fairly neatly parked to the side.
If Tracy and Lee had indeed been the victims of a frenzied road rage attack, who were these men? Who would Lee 42 times, attacking his face, neck, chest, and severing multiple...
This is a severe, sustained, brutal attack with a penknife. Now, the estimates of how many wounds Lee suffered vary. Some local reports said 42. What is clear, he was in the throat, back, front, repeatedly, viciously, and continuously.
The forensics team examined Lee's body and confirmed the detective's suspicion. Whoever committed this crime must have hated Lee deeply and for a long time.
It's 42 movements of your hand. This is not something that you can do in a second or 2 seconds in a moment of madness. You have to keep going, and it is not easy.
While the police were trying to wrap their heads around any possible suspects, Tracy was taken to the hospital. She was bruised, cut, and in shock.
She's treated for those injuries and for shock in hospital and cared for and tended for while police launch a massive murder hunt for whoever has done this terrible thing to Lee.
From the hospital, Tracy told the police that they were looking for a dark-colored Ford Sierra. This was a good enough lead for the detectives.
And obviously we started a vehicle inquiry with the DVLA for the owner details of any vehicle that might fit that description.
Within days, Alvechurch was flooded with journalists and TV reporters. This was a very rare incident in the West Midlands, and the viciousness of the crime was definitely a 1 in a million case.
From the very first moment, it was clear that this was going to be a huge story, an absolutely huge story. Just the idea of a road rage murder made it already a big story. And as the first morning progressed, everything we discovered made it a bigger story.
The media got their hands on photos of Tracy and Lee. They were two young, good-looking people, and the public took an instant liking to both of them.
And so, more and more of the elements that make a big story, young, attractive, bizarre, unimaginable circumstances, all started slotting into place.
This was a nationwide phenomenon. People were praying for Tracy and hoping for the police to find Lee's psychotic killer. But the truth was far away, and it was truly dark. In fact, it was about to get much darker. But this will be revealed in part 2. Hey, thanks for watching, and I hope you're ready to get to the bottom of Tracy and Lee's horrific love story. As always, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more. See you next time, and stay safe.